Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy 1. The topic for our discussion today is the Marxist approach to political economy. Marxism is based on the concept of dialectics, which is something which we see in ancient Greece for the first time, because the Greeks believed that true knowledge could be acquired only through a process of debate and discussion. And this process was given a rather sophisticated form by the ancient Greek thinkers, who called it dialectics, involving three stages: the thesis, whereby a proposition is put forward; an antithesis, which tries to negate the proposition; and the valid elements of the thesis and the antithesis are combined at a third stage, which is called the synthesis. This dialectical framework was borrowed for the first time by the German philosopher Hegel, but Hegel used it to study the world of ideas, which is why the study which Hegel arrived at came to be known as dialectical idealism. It is said that Marx turned Hegel upside down. He borrowed the dialectical framework all right, but Marx believed that it was the material world, the world which we can see, touch, experience, and feel with our sense organs, that is the ultimate reality. And that is why the study which Marx arrived at came to be known as dialectical materialism, because Marx applied the dialectical principles to study the material world. The two important foundational pillars of the Marxist philosophy are dialectical materialism and historical materialism, and it is to these that we will now turn. Dialectical materialism is founded on a number of principles. First, Marx believed that this material world of ours is not an accidental agglomeration of unconnected things, but an integrated totality where everything and phenomenon is inextricably linked up with every other. And that is why, in order to understand any phenomenon, any event in history, it is important to locate it in the context of the constellation of factors that give rise to it, because nothing operates in isolation. The second important principle of dialectical materialism is that nature is in a continuous state of flux, where something new is always being born and something old is always dying and decaying. And that is why it follows from this that we must not try to predispose ourselves to study things which seem to be stable or permanent, because in fact nothing is stable or permanent. Everything is in a process of continuous or ceaseless change. Third principle tries to argue that this change, which is happening in our material world continuously, is a process whereby slow and steady and often imperceptible quantitative changes at one point of time lead to a fundamental qualitative transformation. And this qualitative transformation often takes the shape of a leap from one stage to another. It is neither a movement in circles nor a gradual process, but one which can happen abruptly and suddenly. And the corollary which follows from this important principle of Marxism is that revolutions are not to be considered as historical accidents. Okay? And finally, Marx says that there are contradictions inherent in everything and phenomenon in nature. Everything, every phenomenon has a positive side and a negative side. And it is only through a clash of these that society ultimately is able to move ahead in an onward and upward direction. The significance of dialectical materialism lies in the fact that Marx used these principles to understand the material world, and he extended it to the study of human history. And in fact, that is how Marx arrived at the philosophy of historical materialism. Historical materialism is nothing but human history understood in the light of the principles of dialectical materialism. So, for the purpose of understanding, I will try to explain historical materialism, the entire story of historical materialism, in terms of certain important elements. First, Marx begins his study of history with a fascinating question. He says, why does man live? And in an almost tautological fashion, he answers that man lives in order not to die. Now, if you really go deep into this statement, the implication is that the urge to survive is inherent in man. We all know that death is certain, and yet we make a fervent desire to somehow sustain ourselves, to survive physically, and that is why production becomes the most important activity in the life of man. So at the very outset, we find that in discussing historical materialism, Marx tries to establish the primacy of production among all human activities. Production of all those things which sustain life, like food, shelter, and clothing. And Marx says that human history is nothing but the story of how man has tried to improve all these aspects of life and living and the consequences that have followed from such efforts at improvement. In analyzing the production process, Marx next tries to harp on two important factors. First is what he calls the forces of production, also referred to as instruments of production. Forces of production basically refer to all those elements derived from our material world with the help of which production becomes possible, like land, like including human labor, because labor also is a natural resource. So all natural resources, mineral deposits, land, etc., which go into the production process and make production possible, have been clubbed together by Marx as the forces of production. But production is not an isolated process, and therefore Marx also comes to the important element of what he calls the relations of production. Men are not self-sufficient entities, and therefore in the course of the production process they engage into various relations with each other, and these relations are dubbed by Marx as the relations of production. The forces of production and the relations of production together constitute the process of production, which is why Marx clarifies that it is social production, thereby harping on the fact that it is a social process. And you will please note here that Marx has a tendency to always derive the social out of the economic, as in this case you must have noted that it is the forces of production which pave the road to the relations of production. Now, this material world of ours, Marx clarifies, is in a perpetual state of flux. So, the forces of production keep developing and changing. And as the forces of production change, Marx tries to show us that the forces of production pave the road to changes in the relations of production, and when both the forces of production and the relations of production change, together a change can be noted at the level of the mode of production. Marx refers to several modes of productions that history has witnessed down the ages. And he begins with the first important phase, which he calls primitive communism. Now, this is one phase of human history which is really set apart from other subsequent phases, which I shall clarify in course of time. Primitive communism, as the name suggests, is that phase of history when man first set foot on earth. He was wary about most things around him. He was uncertain about the developments in nature. He somehow managed to survive by gathering forest produce, and he was huddled into some kind of cooperation with other men. But this cooperation was not something which flowed from human volition or conscious will. The uncertainties of nature thrust upon man some kind of a cooperation, and that is why this phase of cooperative existence is dubbed as primitive. But this kind of existence did not continue for very long, because I just told you that the forces of production are not static, but they keep changing and developing. And because the forces of production keep developing, at one point of time man discovers agriculture. When he discovers agriculture, his nomadic existence gets terminated, he is able to settle down, and agriculture brings in its wake the concept of a surplus. Now, this is a significant development because not only is man able to settle down because he has something to fall back upon, but surplus also brings with it the concept of private property. Private property, which for the first time completely alters the character of human society the way it has existed from the time of primitive communism. Because private property splits society into classes. For the first time, you have a class which owns property and a class which does not own property. Now, it may have happened like this, Marx says, that because of some natural calamity like a flood or an earthquake, a particular group may have lost its surplus. But while it has lost its surplus, it has also lost touch with the nomadic style of existence, and therefore those who don't have a surplus, in order to survive, are compelled to seek the help of those who have a surplus. Now, those who have this surplus or property are in a position to offer help, but they won't do that gratis. And that is how relations of domination and subjugation surface, and society comes to be divided into classes. A class that owns the means of production is now able to exploit the class which does not own the means of production, and that is how the primitive communism gives way to the next important phase of human history, which Marx calls slavery. Slavery gives way to feudalism. Feudalism will also pave the way to capitalism. But all these phases, slave society, feudal society, and capitalist society, echo the same important principle that Marx has highlighted in the Communist Manifesto, that the history of all hitherto existing stages, the history of all hitherto existing social stages, are nothing but the story of class and class struggle. However, capitalism is a particular phase of history which deserves particular attention, because it is here that we find that exploitation reaches some kind of a crescendo, in the sense that a feudal society which preceded it was also an exploitative society. But please remember that in feudal society, the feudal lords were, of course, exploiting the serfs all right, but there was still a personal nexus between the exploiter and the exploited, in the sense that if the feudal lord was humane and kind, then the serf stood to have a good deal. But this kind of a personal nexus completely snaps when capitalism surfaces, because in capitalism, the capitalist does not even know who is going to work for him in his factory. So, in capitalism, and that is why Marx particularly draws attention to the capitalist society, the contradictions between the forces of production and the relations of production intensify to an extent that capitalism is in a state of crisis and is threatened with discontinuity as a result of the possibility of a socialist revolution. Let me explain how this happens. You see, capitalism, as it marches ahead, it is driven by the profit motive on part of the capitalists. The capitalists, in order to increase their profit, have no choice but to increase production. Because unless production magnifies, the sales of goods will also not increase, and that is naturally something which will dampen the profits which the capitalists are in the lookout for. So what happens is that capitalism introduces education for the laborers. Now, this education, however, you see, as capitalism becomes more sophisticated, the technology that is involved in magnifying production also needs to be extended to the workers as such, and that is why education becomes a necessary ingredient of capitalist exploitation. But while education is introduced by the capitalists, ostensibly to equip the laboring classes to handle more sophisticated technology and machinery for mass production, education also brings consciousness to the workers and ultimately makes them conscious of their exploitation. That is one side of the story. The other important development which you come across in capitalism is that capitalism is also in its search for new markets, because markets basically means that more and more people will be in a position to buy the goods dished out by capitalist production. Now, as a result, the capitalists are also keen to expand the transport and the communication network system. This transport and communication network system, which capitalism gives vent to, is utilized by the working classes, of course, to get united as a class. And that is how the working classes, they have already become conscious, I told you, because of the education which has been spread by capitalism. Now, using the transport and communication network, which is introduced again by capitalism to ensure that more markets come under the sway of the capitalists, this communication and transport network is utilized by the laboring classes, come to get unified as a class, thanks to the capitalist intervention through education and through transport and communication networks. But this laboring class is able to now transform itself from a class in itself to a class for itself. In other words, for the first time, the workers not only have the characteristics of being the non-owners, by which factor they were already designated as a class in itself, but now, because of the cohesiveness and the unity which has happened because of education and transport and communication, they are in a position to fight for their collective interests. And that is how they get transformed into a class for itself, prepared to fight for their rights. And this is what actually triggers off the possibility of a socialist revolution. So class and class struggle that we are witnessing right from the time of slave society gets intensified through successive stages, and ultimately at the level of capitalism, what happens is the situation becomes ripe, the contradictions mature between the forces of production and the relations of production, as a result of which a socialist revolution clearly emerges. And through a socialist revolution, what happens is, for the first time, a socialist society is born. But I must also clarify here that please remember, students, that there is a fundamental difference between socialism and capitalism. Although these are concepts which we often use interchangeably, there is a subtle and important difference between the two phases, at least from the Marxist point of view. Socialism is very much a class society, but it is a class society with a difference. It is born out of a socialist revolution, but this society is different from previous class societies because for the first time the majority comes to the helm of affairs, and that is the proletariat, which is why the socialist state is also designated as the dictatorship of the proletariat. But this dictatorship of the proletariat is qualitatively different from ordinary dictatorships because it does not want to perpetuate itself. On the contrary, it works towards its own abolition. And as a result, ultimately socialism, operating in the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is able to work towards its own dissolution, thereby leading to communism, which denotes a stage of classlessness. That is why a communist society is not equivalent to a socialist society. A socialist society is very much a class society, but a communist society for the first time denotes a stage of classlessness, which is the ultimate goal of communism, a stage where there will be no property, no classes, no state, and therefore no exploitation of man by man. This social change that we have just seen in the form of a socialist revolution, which triggers off ultimately a socialist society and thereby paves the way finally to the destination of communism, actually the whole story begins at the level of the changes taking place in the mode of production. Now, I have already clarified to you that the mode of production in any society consists of the forces of production and the relations of production. These two together, referred to as the mode of production, constitutes the concept of economic base or substructure of society. Now, society, of course, is not an architectural building, and Marx is trying to conjure up this image simply as a metaphor to drive home the fact that it is the economic mode of production which is the base or the foundation on which society rests. So first the forces of production change, and when the forces of production change, a corresponding change becomes inevitable between the forces of production and the relations of production. When the two change, we can say a change has taken place at the level of the mode of production. That is how you will note that slave society gave way to the feudal society, where the source of wealth was land. Again, when the source of wealth shifted from the land to the factory, you have the inauguration of capitalism. So ultimately, social change happens at the level of the mode of production, and that change is thereafter echoed at the superstructural level. So everything else apart from economics, to put it in simple terms, is something that belongs to the level of the social superstructure, whether it is art, literature, religion, architecture, music, anything that you can think of, state, politics, anything else apart from economics, in Marxist terminology, constitutes the superstructure of society. So the base or the economic mode of production holds the superstructure or the rest of society. And if you analyze any element of the superstructure, be it religion, be it politics, be it state, be it fundamental rights, be it literature, you will find that directly or indirectly, any element of the superstructure echoes the interests of the economically dominant class. Okay? That is why we must understand the concept of a revolution in its right connotations. Normally, any transformation, any change is dubbed as a revolution. In Marxist lexicon, however, revolution has a different connotation. Revolution refers to total social transformation, which entails not merely a cosmetic or a superficial change at the level of the superstructure, it also entails a change that is simultaneously happening at the level of the substructure. So when both substructure and superstructure change, then only can we say that a revolution has taken place in the true sense of the term. In that sense, most pre-socialist revolutions, take for instance the French Revolution, would not qualify to be a true revolution in the Marxist sense of the term. To understand this concept, we therefore have to understand the concept of a socialist revolution, which for the first time entails changes taking place at both the substructural and the superstructural levels. So this is basically how human history has progressed from ancient times, from the time of primitive communism, through successive stages like slave system, feudal system, capitalism, ultimately leading to socialism through a socialist revolution, with the hope that it will culminate ultimately in communism, which we are yet to witness. But it is revolution which has been the motor of history, and revolution has been always triggered by important changes taking place at the level of the mode of production, where it all begins. Because mode of production is closely linked to the material world, which is in a perpetual state of flux, changes in the level of the mode of production trigger of changes at the level of the relations of production. So forces of production change, followed by changes in the relations of production. Together, the mode of production changes, and these contradictions intensify and precipitate changes at the superstructural level also. When both substructure and superstructure change, we can say a change has taken place at the level of the society. And one social phase gives way to another social formation. And this is how Marx tries to characterize history as a series of different social formations, beginning with primitive communism and ultimately ending in communism. One important clarification is, what is the difference between primitive communism and communism? Because in both these cases, you find that private property is conspicuous by its absence. Okay, both denote stages of communal living, both denote a stage of classlessness. But the important difference is that unlike in primitive communism, where people communal existence was thrust upon by circumstances, in case of communism, it is a result of human volition. Man has consciously aspired for bringing an end to all kinds of exploitation, and as a result of this, it is through human effort that man has moved towards a stage of classlessness, which is the ultimate phase of human history. That is, in a nutshell, the story of historical materialism, which is also referred to as Marx's materialist interpretation of history. There are several questions now, friends, which we can address. The first important thing is, how do we evaluate Marxism or the story of historical materialism as an approach to understanding politics and society? There are two common criticisms that have been generally raised in response to Marx's fascinating theory of historical materialism. The first question is Marxism the same as fatalism? In other words, the allegation is, try and understand, the allegation is, and Marx himself was so fascinated by his own understanding of history, and when he was particularly able to discern these laws through which history has unfolded down the ages, he kept referring to these as laws of social development. And that is why critics have raised the allegation that if these are laws of historical development, what is the point of human action? Because if society is going to operate on the basis of scientific laws of history, as Marx often referred to them as, you see, the question is, why should there be human action? Then obviously a phase like feudalism would culminate in capitalism, and capitalism by its own inherent contradictions would pave the road to socialism, and so on and so forth. Now, a fair response to this criticism is found in Marx himself, when he said that Marx never wanted to suggest that history does everything. He was conscious that it is man who does everything, that it is man who makes his own history. And that is why he says that these laws of historical development are not to be understood as rigid scientific laws. They are rather laws having the nature of tendencies. And that is why Marx never precluded the alternative. He never suggested that this is the one and only way that history will unfold. He was merely, on the basis of a scientific, an objective understanding of the past, he was trying to suggest some of the ways through which the future will unfold, and that is what made him refer to the laws of historical materialism as laws of social development. The other important criticism is the allegation of economic determinism that has been raised against historical materialism. That ultimately it seems that Marx is suggesting that every event, every political occurrence, every state, everything that we witness in society is propelled by the economic factor. Here again, Marx has an important clarification to make. What he tried to show, and that is something he had suggested at the very outset in his understanding of dialectical materialism, that nature is not an accidental agglomeration of unconnected things, but an integrated totality where everything and phenomenon is inextricably linked up with every other. In other words, what Marx seems to be harping on is the fact that any event or phenomenon is propelled by a host of factors. Okay, it is caused by a multiplicity of elements, of which you will generally find that the economic element is predominant. But to say that the economic factor is predominant is not to ascribe any exclusivity to it. It is one among many factors, and often the dominant factor. So we can safely come to the conclusion that historical materialism is neither historical fatalism nor is it economic determinism. It is rather an objective understanding of history based on material conditions of life, and it does not flow from any kind of intuition or any kind of rigid ideas. A final question is that many consider the downfall of USSR, the erstwhile USSR, to be a case of downfall of Marxism. This perhaps is to be seen in a broader perspective, because there, if you read the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you will find that there are many factors which were peculiar to the Soviet experience. So, for instance, Soviet Union made one leap from the stage of feudalism directly to the stage of socialism, omitting the phase of capitalism, which Marx would consider to be a necessary stage in the creation of socialism. Because Marx had repeatedly harped in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie historically had played a revolutionary role. And the revolutionary role, I have already explained, consists in welding the people together into a cohesive population. Although capitalism definitely remains an exploitative phase in human history. But as a result of this, of the omission of this factor, the cohesiveness that is a necessary ingredient of a socialist state seemed conspicuous by its absence in the Soviet experience. So there were many factors in the Soviet Union which make us consider that perhaps the way socialism happened in the Soviet Union was not the way Marx would have envisaged in the context of society. And in fact, we have also seen that there were differences between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg about whether it was opportune for the Soviet Union at that historical juncture to have embraced a revolution. So that is a different story altogether. In all fairness, one can say that perhaps socialism, or the way Marx has understood the ideology of communism, is pregnant with several possibilities, and it would perhaps be improper to try and blow the Soviet case out of proportion and consider it to be equivalent to the downfall or the demise of socialism. Socialism definitely remains an ideology with lot of potential and lot of messages for the future of human civilization. Thank you.